you need some wide receiver help, there's a few guys on the wire that can help you heading into Week 15 and Week 2 of the playoffs. The first guy's KJ Hamler of the Denver Broncos. Hamler, I know he didn't have much targets or much work, but he got the job done in this game. 2 catches, 86 yards for 2 touchdowns is Hamler. Hamler, he's a speed receiver. They drafted Jerry Jeudy and him in this year's NFL draft was the Denver Broncos. And Hamler, he's been pretty solid now the last few weeks, except that disaster game versus New Orleans where he had negative points. But last week versus Kansas City, 5 points. This week, 22.6 with the 2 touchdowns. So Hamler, he's available in 97% of leagues. And he's a guy, I think his targets and looks are going to go up, especially with Noah Fant going down in this game in the first quarter and not returning. So we got to look at his status. So Hamler, he's worth an ad. And next week he's got the Buffalo Bills in a game where Denver could be trailing and Hamler could get some garbage points for you and your fantasy team. So Hamler's the first player I'm going to look at this week. The second guy is Keenan Cole Sr. Keenan Cole, he showed flashes on and off the whole season. And right now I think he's the best receiver to own in Jacksonville. DJ Chark's just not getting the job done. And Cole yesterday with 7 catches, 67 yards, and a touchdown on 12 targets versus Tennessee. And I know Minshew and Glennon split in this game pretty much of their playing time. Cole, though, like I said, he showed flashes every few weeks. The last 3 weeks before this, he didn't have more than 8 fantasy points. But this week versus Tennessee, he had a huge game. Now he's got Baltimore coming up in a game we're going to see Jacksonville throw the ball 45, 50 times possibly. So Keenan Cole, he's available in 75% of fantasy leagues, and he's not a bad get if he's going to get the targets and the workload like he did versus Tennessee yesterday. So he's the second receiver. The third guy's Nelson Agholor of the Las Vegas Raiders. Agholor, another guy who's been inconsistent, but he's been putting up decent numbers. And yesterday, a great ball game, 5 catches, 100 yards, and a touchdown for Agholor, which was good for 21 fantasy points versus a tough Indianapolis team. And next week, he's got a decent matchup on Thursday, actually. This game is versus the Los Angeles Chargers, which last time in that game, he had 13.5 fantasy points versus the Chargers was Agholor in Week 9 with 2 catches, 55 yards, and a touch. So Agholor, he's had double-digit fantasy days in 3 out of his last 4 games, and he's a good guy to get, I think, on waivers this week. And he's still available in 64% of fantasy leagues. So Agholor's a guy I'm going to target. The fourth guy is Russell Gage of the Atlanta Falcons. We saw Julio Jones go down with the hamstring and missed the game yesterday. And Gage, he had a good ball game in his absence, was Russell Gage, with a nice game, 5 catches, 82 yards, and he also threw a 39-yard touchdown to Calvin Ridley in this game. So this guy, they've used him a lot this season as a gadget guy or a third receiver, but in the number 2 role, he's had a couple huge games this season, and the last 2 weeks now, a 15-point fantasy game, and then yesterday, the 20, and now next week in Week 15, he's got a great matchup versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers that give up the 4th most fantasy points to wide 9th most fantasy points, to wide receivers. And Gage, he's available in 89% of fantasy leagues, and if Julio Jones is out, this is a guy I'm going to go out there and try to get is Russell Gage. The 5th receiver is Lynn Bowden of the Miami Dolphins. Lynn Bowden, he qualifies in some leagues as a wide receiver and a running back. So this guy, he's a dual threat for this Dolphin team. And he led receivers in routes and targets, especially with Devontae Parker going down in yesterday's ball game. Lynn Bowden, 7 catches, 82 yards on 9 targets, and 1 carry for 2 yards. He qualifies at receiver and running back. He's available in 99% of leagues. And next week, he's got a decent matchup versus the New England Patriots. And now, with the injury to Parker and Grant's been banged up as well, this guy, he's going to have a role. He's going to play some running back, I believe, and some wide receiver with Myles Gaskin banged up as well and on the COVID list. So Lynn Bowden Jr., he's a interesting guy to look at this week heading into the waiver wire. And a guy I keep an eye on, possibly you don't have to claim him, but definitely look out to get him if you need a receiver or even a flex or a running back. And the 6th and final guy is Hansen on the Houston Texans. Hansen, again, with a decent role yesterday. He was a guy I mentioned last week to pick up on the waiver wire was Chad Hansen, but he had 21% of the targets over the last 2 weeks. He's available in 98% of fantasy leagues, and he had a good ball game yesterday, was Hansen, with 12.5 fantasy points, 7 catches, 56 yards on 7 targets, and in Week 13 versus Indy, 5 catches, 100 yards. So he's getting the workload and the targets. I know Brandon Cooks was out of this ball game, and reports are saying Cook should be back in Week 15 versus the Indianapolis Colts. But Hansen, even in 3 receiver sets, he's been used, and he's a guy I think you could count on, or a guy you could at least stash on your bench. So that's a few wide receivers I'm going to look to add on the waiver wire this week heading into Week 15.